Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. This is our second class, Exploring in the Outer Court, this book by Annie Besant. And today we are going to continue with the second chapter that is about the mastery of our thoughts.
We've read, or throughout my years in Theosophy, I've read a bunch of different books on thought power and thought control and things like that. But in this small chapter here, Annie Besant really does a lot of divisions. She breaks down, the thought control of the righteous and virtuous man as opposed to the thought control of the candidate in the outer court. And then she breaks down where those thoughts come from by defining for us what the soul is, where the mind comes from later in the chapter. So it was, even in just a small chapter without being a whole book in itself, she really did some delineating.
Yes, and you can see that she's just mentioning several of these subjects which can be expanded to a small book in itself. So we will explain a little of the background to what she says here.
Right, so two things from two standpoints. One, if you've read a lot, these are really good touch points on that spiral of gaining knowledge. And also, if you haven't read a lot, they're good hints or a nice little overview of the subjects here. Mm-hmm. All right, let's get started. A moral person who has deliberately set before himself an ideal of virtue will recognize that the passions and the appetites of the body, the lower emotions which hurry people away without thought, all that side of human nature which is played upon from without, so that one acts without reflection, is to be kept under control.
So we can see in all religions there are different commandments or rules that try to encourage people to control the emotions. And some may ask, why is that? Is it not a judgmental attitude? Why can't I express, whatever I feel? And that may be okay, although if we look, deeply, it's rarely okay. But it may be okay for a person that is looking at life just as something that, a place where he can attain things. But when we care about people, about organizations, situations, we can see how when we are driven by some of the passions, as it is sometimes called, by anger or jealousy or any of these, we can see how we do things that when we are not driven by those emotions, we would not do. So it seems clear that, there may be not a problem with the emotion itself, but there is a problem when we are taken over by the emotion and we are driven to do things that we would not choose to do. So a basis for the spiritual work is to begin to work and gain a certain level of control over our emotions, not in order not to feel them, but to have enough freedom not to let ourselves be driven by them when it is not the right action, the appropriate response.
There's a U-shaped paradigm that starts with our actions are completely driven by our desires or by our sensations or by our thoughts. And so therefore rules are put in place or social norms are put in place to kind of hold us there until we're able to kind of catch up, to mature. So as that comes down, we have these rules, but our goal is to ascend to the place or get back to the place where we no longer need rules because our actions and our thoughts and our emotions come from, or our feelings come from a natural, spontaneous place of purity or goodness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this stage of controlling the emotions or trying to control the emotions, it's a complex stage. If it is not done with intelligence, it can lead to repression, as modern psychology has seen. But on the other hand, just expressing whatever emotions we have, if they are destructive, is a source of problems in the world. So let's see how we can approach this from a theosophical point of view.
What we mean in ordinary parlance by a self-controlled person is one who exercises this mental mastery over the lower nature, over the desires. When we say self-controlled, it is the mind that is thought of as the self who is controlling. This person is one in whom the mind has been largely developed, so that when he comes to act and to decide upon an action, he is not determined by the various attractions that may surround him outside. He is determined by a mass of experiences recorded in his memory as a rule of conduct at which it has arrived in a moment of calm.
So as we can see here, the first stage is the mind controlling the emotions. The person thinking, I am this mind, this thinker, I am this will that is trying to control the emotions. And we do it based on, as Annie Besant says, they are based on experience, based on what we learned. We may have learned by direct experience or by education or by observation that certain actions or that certain emotions, when they lead to actions, that is something that produces suffering, or produces conflict. So the first step in this self-control is the mind saying, I know this attracts me, but it's not healthy. This repels me, but it's not right to refuse it. You know, the mind, they are still, even though there are the feelings, the mind is able to consider what is the right action. And we do this, most of humanity do this in simple things, you know. The mother or father that is waking up in the middle of the night by the baby crying, you know, their desire is to keep sleeping, but then the mind says, I have to do it. But then when we go to other aspects of life where we don't feel such a connection, like with the baby, for example, then it is the strength of the emotions is normally greater than that of the mind. But eventually, the idea is to get to that kind of relationship.
This stage of development, which is by no means a low stage, is one in which the person has deliberately set himself to work to conquer and to rein in and to manage this lower nature. But there is another stage to which this person may come. He will begin to understand that when his mind is working, it is constantly sending out with the world active entities that work for good or for evil, which often affect the minds and the lives of people with whom the creator of these entities is not in personal contact. I believe this is the part in the book where she talks about and she differentiates between, you know, first we have no idea that our emotions or our desires are dragging us into action. And then we realize that. And then that's the stage of where we control. We have rules and we know how to follow the rules. But then the next stage is to realize that these emotions or these thoughts in this chapter, these thoughts actually have energy. These thoughts are things, is what one of the Mahatmas says. So that realization then kind of opens up your perspective. You now realize that, hey, what's going on in my mind is just not automatic, but for this reason that they're sending and giving, I need to be able to control them. Mm-hmm. So it's just a different reason. It's not for social norms, but it's because we're an active participant in life.
Yes, and that is important and is part of what distinguishes the regular religious life from a more esoteric approach. because the regular religious life is based on our actions, on what we do. So the control of the emotions and thoughts is only insofar as it translates into action. As we are going to see next week a little about this, the esoteric approach begins in the opposite way, because thoughts and emotions themselves are a reality. As Michele was saying, they are an energy that affects others, even if we don't notice it. Then this control of our emotions and our minds have to step a level higher, not only that these are not expressed in action, which is in itself, as Besant says, difficult, but also to learn how to deal with the negative emotions or thoughts.
He realizes that he may be quite out of sight of the public, only influencing an exceedingly small circle of friends and relatives, and yet he has a power which transcends either the force of example or the forces of speech. Sitting alone and isolated from others, so far as the physical world is concerned, he may be exercising a force potent for good or for evil, purifying or fouling the minds of his generation, helping or hindering the progress of the world. These subtle energies of the thought exercise a wider influence just because they are so subtle that they are unrecognized by the masses whom they affect. And this is well documented in Leadbeater's books when he talks about the different planes. You know, here in the physical plane, for us to go from one place to another, we need a vehicle to take us there. On the next subtler plane, to go from one place to another still takes time, but it's not, it's more instantaneous, or I don't know if that's the right word, but it's quicker. Let's just say it's quicker. And then on the next subtlest plane, the mental plane, the plane of thoughts, things are instantaneous. You think and it's done. So you think about being someplace and you're there, for a crude example, a rough example. So that's what we have to come to understand, to realize how much, even though we're away from the world, how much we still influence it.
Mm-hmm. Annie Besant will talk here about a kind of ecology of the mind and the emotions, because in the same way that when we do something that is polluting the atmosphere, we are polluting the whole atmosphere. In a similar way, when we think or we feel, we are affecting the whole mental atmosphere or emotional atmosphere, for good or for ill. Now, when our power is small, our power of thought and emotion is small, then our influence on the whole atmosphere is small. Like, it's like we have a garden and we keep burning plastic, and of course that throws some fumes in the atmosphere that are not good. But if you compare that with what a factory is doing, it is not all that significant. Now, when you grow and you generate a factory, then what you produce has a far greater impact. So in a similar way, as the person approaches the outer court and even more goes into the temple, thoughts and emotions become far more powerful, and they are more powerful for good or for ill. The idea is that in this training that Annie Besant is proposing at this point, we can start little by little to have a handle on these forces that we call emotions and thoughts, because in the future, we may become a blessing for humanity. Even today, with the little that we can, affect the mental atmosphere, we still are doing that. So we can start being a blessing little by little. But, a disciple and even more a Mahatma is something far more powerful.
Ed says it may be easier to see that others' thoughts affect our thoughts.
Yes. And if as we grow in self-observation, we can see this. Many times we feel in ways that we don't know why we feel in that way or why certain thoughts come into our minds. And we normally assume that somehow we are producing them. But as we grow in self-observation, we start realizing that some thoughts are really coming from somewhere else, even from a person. We may find out that the person was thinking of us. The typical example is thinking of a person before the phone rings, or thinking of a person that we have not been in touch for months, and then we have an email there from that person. So in those little examples, we can see how we are really affecting others. And as we said, as we grow in power, we can become really helpers of the world, but we have to have all these powers under control.
George writes, do similar thoughts of various individuals tend to aggregate into what are essentially egregores?
Egregores. Yeah, egregores, I think. Yes, the Theosophical literature calls them elementals, and the idea is that every time we think, a form is produced. If the thought is strong, think and feel also. If it is just thought, it's on the mental plane. If it is thought and emotion, it also is on the astral plane. And the stronger the thought form, the longer it will last on the inner planes. And when we meditate, for example, we may be producing very strong little angels, in a sense, that go out in blessing. But at the same time, with our negative thoughts, we may create little demons, let's say. And there is a tendency for the forces to aggregate. And Besant is going to talk about that, so we will discuss that soon.
He will realize how mighty is the responsibility of simply exercising the faculties of the mind. He will realize that his responsibility extends much farther than he can see, that he is responsible in a very real way, often for the crimes that happen in the society to which he belongs, as well as for the deeds of heroism that may also happen in that society. Every act is a coming into manifestation, a veritable incarnation of ideas. Everyone who takes part in the generation of the ideas takes part in the responsibility of the action. So it's really easy to forget one way or the other that our good thoughts or our noble thoughts bring noble consequences or noble vibrations, reactions, and that our less than noble bring the same thing. And like Pablo said, and Annie Besant said here, is that now at least it's not affecting so much, it's not affecting so far, but it's really something, it still is an effect, and it still can be a help or a hindrance to everyone else out there.
Mm-hmm. In people like, for example, Krishnamurti would say, we are the world, and he would say that the wars that are in the world are an exteriorization of our own inner wars. And the foundation for that is this that Annie Besant is talking about, both the good and the bad aspects of this. Every time we generate thoughts and emotions, they tend to aggregate, and this is like the generation of karma. So more and more energy is added to something, and that energy precipitates actions. So in a certain sense, we are all participants of, the Martin Luther Kings, as well as the Hitlers. Of course, this is not to take it with a sense of guilt or fear. It's just that we have to realize we are all connected. We are in a pool, and when I move, I generate waves that will affect everybody, and all the other waves will affect me. So knowing this, without fear, without sense of guilt or condemnation, we can take advantage of, sometimes people may complain that they don't have a lot of power. Well, because this is the time to take advantage of that fact and start working on our thoughts and emotions.
Understanding this, he would begin to realize that he must control his thoughts. he must have some choice as to the kind of thoughts that he generates. He also finds that the kind of thoughts that he attracts to himself from the outer world will be very largely determined by the nature of the thoughts that he himself generates, so that he is not only a magnet sending out lines of thought force over the area of his magnetic field, but he is also a magnet attracting towards himself the substances which answer to the magnetic force that he sends out.
So here is all this is again part of this complete connection that we have with the environment. And when we try to hold positive thoughts, and by positive I mean from a spiritual point of view, not positive thoughts in the sense of I have all the cars that I like, I have, all that is not really positive thought thinking, that is selfish thinking. By positive thought, I mean, when we are concerned about the general welfare, truth, compassion, being productive in the world, all these things, we start attracting those thought forms that are floating, let's say, on the mental plane and the feelings on the astral plane, and they become an encouragement. They make stronger our resolution, our love for the higher. Similarly, when we generate negative thoughts, we start attracting all the negative thoughts, and we see how depression or things like this is like a spiral. We start feeling something, and then that immediately is calling for those kind of thought forms that keeps on feeding the mood.
Now, the New Age has taken this idea and turned it in general, and turned it into something very selfish. So I'm to put out there what I want in the world so that the law of attraction, so I can attract it to me. And that works at a certain level. But I felt so sorry for my poor mom. She made this little I want board or whatever it was called, and she was putting out there the law of attraction, and she just couldn't figure out for the life of her why she wasn't manifesting $1 million. So there is some taking these ideas of the esoteric science and making them a little too simple or a little too selfish in that sense. Mm-hmm. He will begin to understand that in generating a good thought, he is not only discharging his supreme duty to his fellows, but that, as ever happens, when man is in harmony with the divine law, he himself is gaining by that which he gives. In each case in which he gives to the world a noble thought, he has set up in himself an attractive center to which other noble thoughts will come of their own accord, drawn, as it were, by magnetic affinity, so that his own mind will be helped and strengthened by these thoughts that flow into it from without.
Mm-hmm. There is this movie branded, I think it's called, where we can see all these collective thought forms that are generated by the desires of people and all this. And the movie shows how these collective thought forms, these kind of egregories, react in turn on each person, trying to stimulate the same kind of desire. So, and this we can see even in daily life. We know how contagious emotions are. So when the emotions are strong, we start feeling the same emotions. How is that possible? We can see in these little things that there must be truth behind.
Right, there are normal occurrences. We've all walked into a room and felt happy because a happy person is there. Or, as there's somebody who's not so happy that has brought down the mood of the room. Yeah. So those small things are just little indications of what is written here. He recognizes also that when he sends out a foul thought, he has made in his own consciousness a similar center that attracts the baser thoughts in the atmosphere, and so increase his own tendencies towards evil as the others increase his tendencies towards good. He learns to understand this mental brotherhood which binds all men together, these ties that stretch out in every direction. In his daily life, he will begin to deal more with thought than with action, because it is in that region of the invisible that all the forces which come down into the psychic and the physical life are generated. And here's where she makes the distinction between the virtuous, righteous man and the candidate in the outer court. So we're more worried about actions before, and now because of our understanding, we now are more concerned or more thoughtful about our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a step further when he comes within the outer court. This candidate finds that he recognizes something that is behind the mind, something which is greater than the mind, to which the mind bears a relation that is analogous to the relation borne by the lower desire mind to the mind itself. Just as in the course of growth a man recognizes the mind above the desires, he realizes now that beyond this mind, which seemed so great, so mighty, is something which is vaster, which only shines out for a moment and then again is veiled. And this we see today. Our current evolutionary scheme is working on the mind. And you can see all the great minds that have been born out of it, and how the leaders are ones that have great minds. But it doesn't necessarily mean that values or morals come with that mind. And that's because we still think that the mind is king, or the mind is to be worshipped, or the mind is developing the mind as much as you can is the end. Eventually, we realize that there is more to the mind. And when this happens, then we can put that aside and know that it's not just having a cunning mind or a sharp mind that is really the goal in life.
Mm-hmm. And then in the experience of the aspirant, you see that Annie Besant here is making a progression. She said at the beginning, first, this self-control is done assuming that we are the mind. This self-control is done from the mind, and the consciousness is identified with the mind as the controller. And so first, what we try to control is the action. Then, as we talked about, we start realizing that what needs to be controlled are the thoughts and the emotions. And then here, Annie Besant says there is a further step. We begin to perceive that there is something beyond the mind, and that the mind is not the self, that the self seems to be, behind this mind from a certain point of view. And that is what she's going to explore now.
He recognizes dimly, poorly, not yet by knowledge, but by hearsay, that he has caught a glimpse of the soul, that to him a ray of light has come downwards into the mind from something that is above it, and yet he dimly seems to feel in some strange sense that he is identical with it, so that at first there will be a confusion and a groping in the darkness between this which seems to be himself and yet greater than he is.
Mm-hmm. And for example, working on self-observation, on watching the thoughts, on mindfulness, awareness, this is part of what opens the door to realizing that there is another me in myself. And actually, many people, when they start working on this, they have this feeling like they are in two places at the same time. They feel they are the one that is thinking, and at the same time, they feel they are the one that is watching the thinking. So how can I be in two places at the same time? Who am I? Am I the thinker? Am I the observer? And so at the beginning, as Annie Besant says, there is this strange sense, there is confusion, but as we continue with our work, more and more we begin to realize that we are this awareness that is, beyond the mind in a certain sense, not outside of the mind, but it's an awareness that is like embracing the mind and transcending it.
What we call mind is the part of the soul that is working in the brain, sorely fettered by the brain, with what is literally the burden of the flesh upon it, making its consciousness dimmer. For it cannot pierce through this thicker veil of matter, and as it works in it, it shows out the powers of the soul. For it is the soul itself, although clothed in this limitation of matter, and as such of the soul, it can manifest through the brain in the mind of the person that we know. But what the man in the outer court understands is that it is this soul which is himself, and that the mind is only its passing manifestation. Right before this part in the book, Annie Besant defines what the soul is. And she really explains it in her poetic beauty, her bedtime story beauty, where the soul is really a densified spirit. So she starts with spirit, and she says eventually a mist is seen. And then that mist begins to densify and densify. And as it densifies, it becomes the soul. And then from there, the soul comes in and enters into, mental, astral, and physical matter. And as it does, it separates itself from that beginning spirit, but it's just a densification of the spirit. And as it comes down, as she says here, for it cannot pierce through this thicker veil of matter, it's hard at first without knowing it that spirit, that pure spirit, knows that it's pure spirit and doesn't realize that it's not just the body.
Yes, so all these are different ways to try to explain allegorically what happens, because what Besant is saying here is that the one that is speaking right now, the one that is listening, is actually the soul, but it is the soul in a state of confusion, in a state of forgetfulness. It is the soul like in a dream. When we are in a dream, it is our own consciousness that is in the dream. But in the dream, we may have forgotten what our real, in quotation marks, physical life is. We may think that we are, in a completely different environment. And because we think that, we are actually living it. Now, the one in the dream is us, but confused, So in a similar way, the thinker, the mind is the soul, but is the soul confused? Through the process of meditation, of purification, of self-observation, all these things that we are going to see throughout the webinar, it's like we as a soul begin to awaken. We begin to realize that we are far more than this limitation. And even if we work through the limitation, now we work with a completely different feeling.
And then he begins to understand that just as the body and the desire nature are to be subject to the mind, which is part of the soul in prison, so that mind itself is to be subject to the great soul, of which it is only the projected representative of the moment, that it is only an instrument, only an organ of the soul, manifested for the sake of the work it performs.
Mm-hmm. So here, the mind first tried to control the action, then the mind tried to control the emotions. Now the soul begins to try to have mastery over the mind itself. This is when, for example, we start trying to learn how not only how to control our emotions, but also how to control our thoughts, how to stop thinking about things that we don't want. The first stage is the stage of trying to control the mind itself. And Annie Besant says, who is controlling the mind? It is the soul at the beginning, which through the mind realizes that the mind has to be controlled. And then, as we are going to see, as this progresses, the soul has to learn to go beyond the mind completely, not only to control the mind through the mind, but to realize its own nature beyond the mind. But we will see that later.
And I just want to touch on some practical aspects of doing this. and I can't remember if it was last week we talked about it. But the practice or the meditation, and I don't even call it meditation. My new name is just concentration. I used to say that concentration was part, when we sit to meditate, our first part is concentration, and then we go into meditation, and then eventually contemplation. But now I'm learning that concentration is a whole meditation in itself, that I may not even get to the meditating part, for a few decades. But that's very important. So that's where I'm figuring how to do this. I'm figuring how to sit with it and make sure that my mind, that I'm controlling things, that I'm pulling my mind or my thoughts where it wants to do. And then I'm doing it throughout the day when I'm paying attention and being mindful in every aspect of what I'm doing.
So this is part of the soul awakening at the level of the mind and realizing that I am not the mind. The mind is my instrument, and I have to learn how to use this instrument instead of being used by the instrument. There is this phrase, I don't know if it was Mark Twain or somebody that said, man created tools, and now he is a tool of his tools. And that is what happens with the soul. The power of thought, of thinking, is a tool of the soul. But at the beginning, we become a tool of the tool.
And Leadbeater gives that really hit it home for me. He says that if I'm a cook, I would never say that my great cooking, was because of the spatula I used or the pan that I used. I know that I was the cook and I was the one that do that. Well, the same thing with our mind, with our mind, that who we really are is not that thinking. And Deborah asks, so a person can really know their soul. If this is too personal, do you know anyone who knows their soul? And I think I would say, for someone who doesn't have these great flashes of inspiration all the time, but I think I know I touch my soul when I can find that contentment, when I can find that moment that is, I get it, or when I can feel that strength in the midst of a storm. So it's those little moments that I think I find my soul.
And all language is, as I just said, allegorical. It's not that, when to know the soul means that you, whoever you are, was introduced, for example, Deborah, this is your soul. You shake hands with your soul, and then you say, okay, I know my soul. When we talk about knowing we are the soul, it is a summary of a state of consciousness. The state of consciousness, whenever our bodies have a certain desire or tendency, or our emotions, or even our minds, whenever our personality wants to go in a certain direction. But there is this intelligence in us that recognizes this direction is not a healthy or correct direction, even if we are wrong, but there is this, with the elements that this intelligence has at the moment, there is this sense of this action is not healthy. And when one says, I don't want to do that, even though the mind or the emotions or the body or all of them want to do it, that means that we know intuitively that we are more than this. Because if not, what happens normally is that whatever a person desires, that person does that because it's on my desires. But when you start opposing the desires that are unhealthy, that means that you are already sensing that you are something more than the desires. Now, this sense that I am more than this becomes stronger and stronger and more dominant until you just feel the personality, is something external to me. And that is what you can call knowing the soul. So it's more a state of consciousness, not a vision or something like that.
Or know it by name.
Yes. And we all begin to know the soul gradually, little by little. If we are attending this webinar, it's because we have begun to know that we are the soul, even if we don't put it in those words.
Right. Our candidate who knows all this will realize that it is this soul, which is I, the soul which has come through all these past lives and has been building itself in the coming. That is the I that is himself, so far as yet can see. And then he begins to understand why it is said that at the very outset he has to distinguish between the I that endures and this mind, which is only a passing manifestation of the I.
Mm-hmm. So this is the task for the outer court, to begin to distinguish the permanent I in us, or this more permanent sense of I-ness in us, and the sense of I am the thought, or I am this emotion, this wish, or this body.
Those words that sound strange at first come from the lips of the wise one. Before thou takest thy first step, learn to discern the real from the false, the ever-fleeting from the everlasting. And this distinction is drawn between the mind that is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. The mirror needs the breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. He is bidden to seek out the Raja of the senses so as to understand him, for he is the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. And the disciple is told, the mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. And these quotes are from The Voice of the Silence.
Mm-hmm. They are all from different parts. So these are every one of these phrases are, they have a deep meaning, but basically they all go in this direction. The mind gets conditioned. The mind generates illusions, and
that's the dust on the mirror.
Exactly. And then we need the wisdom that comes from the soul to remove the illusion. So first we have to start learning about how the mind works, start realizing how the mind takes us into or produces illusions, and that is to understand the thought producer that awakes illusion. And then little by little we have to learn how to stop that process of generating illusions.
And on those words the candidate, if he be wise, reflects, what part can it be which this mind plays, which seems so mighty a function that it stood as the man himself in the lower world? What is its function after all? If the first step upon the path is to distinguish what is illusory from what is real, and the mind in some subtle fashion is connected with the making of the illusion. He who produces thought is he who awakes illusion, and unless the disciple can get rid of the elusive power of the mind, he will never be able to penetrate beyond the outer court. This is one of the paradoxes, and it goes from the slayer of the mind is the slayer of the real, and then it is our duty to slay the slayer.
Mm-hmm. And of course, who is the disciple that has to slay the slayer, to slay the mind? Obviously, by disciple, the voice of the silence is referring to the soul, because it's not telling mind you have to slay yourself. It's saying the disciple has to slay the mind, and by that it is meant the soul. Now, it is important to study in Theosophical literature. There are descriptions of what the soul is in terms of states of consciousness. So whenever we are in this state of quiet observation, watching at our thoughts, Blavatsky says, who is watching the thoughts? It's not the thought looking at the thought. It is the soul looking at the thoughts. when we are trying to look through the thoughts, it is the mind watching. But when we are watching the thoughts themselves, we are moving to begin to act as a soul. So awareness is important.
And that's a subtle feeling at first. For me, I noticed, I've heard this, I've heard Pablo say this, and I've read it before, and it's just, at first, it's all these words that are kind of just jumbled together. But I think it's one of the things that we have to understand what the practice is, and we kind of have to have a bit of trust to do the practice in order to see what the outcome of the practice is. So at first, it's very subtle. You can, when you sit and you concentrate and you watch those thoughts, eventually there becomes a little bit of a gap where you feel, oh, wait, I'm not that. I'm not attached to that anymore. That's not me any longer. And as you continue to watch, all you need is that little glimpse at first, and then eventually it gets more and more, and then you'll be able to tell the difference between when you're engaged with the thought and when you're the watcher of the thoughts.
Yeah, and it is exactly that. We normally feel I am the one thinking. But if you start working on this, on watching how the mind thinks, at some point you start getting this feeling, wait, I'm not thinking, I'm the one watching. And it's this that we were talking about before. And at the beginning, it just comes as a glimpse, and then we feel we are the thinker again. But like with anything else in life, little by little with practice, we will get there. We get to the point where we can be the witness, the observer.
And then, listening still to the teacher, he hears a voice which bids him seek to blend his mind and soul. His work then will be to make some change in this lower mind, which shall make it capable of blending with the higher, some destruction of its illusory power, which shall enable it to know its own parent, for whom it comes, that the Father and the Son may once more become one. Within this process, she lays out these processes very nice, or these stages very nice. There is a stage where, kind of like before this, where you realize that you're not the thinker or you're not the feeler, and that there's a space there, but there still are times where you're kind of like, okay, I know I'm not this, but I'm going to let it drag me this way. And that's where you just have to rein it in and try again and not lose hope.
Yes, and this is, it's like, I guess, like, in the spiritual life, the metaphors of the battles and the war is very frequently used, and it seems at first, paradoxical, but sometimes it is a good metaphor, because it is like a very difficult battle. I guess that you advance and then you lose ground, and then you advance again, and little by little, coming back and forth, you may keep gaining ground. So yes, at some point we are in that state of consciousness in which we feel we are not the thinker, and the next minute we may feel that we are the thinker, and we may remember that we are not the thinker. But the truth is that our state of consciousness right now is, I feel I am the thinker. So our states of consciousness always fluctuate. But again, as Michele said, we shouldn't expect to be able to stay always there. We shouldn't expect not to fall back into this is just natural. What happens is that in time, that state of the witness, for example, becomes more easily available. But yeah, this movement is.
As I've mentioned before in the past, the symbol of the Theosophical Society depicts that very nicely. Within the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, are the two triangles which make up the six-pointed star. And if you look at it closely, the triangles aren't laying on top of one another, or they're not one on top of the other. They're intertwined, and that intertwiningness is the symbol of where we are at this point in our life. Our spirit is very intricately intertwined or engaged with matter, and that's that battleground that Pablo was mentioning. And then inside that is the Ankh, the Egyptian Ankh, which has the circle which represents spirit and the cross which represents matter. So spirit is ruling over matter. So that's the direction we're going, and that's what she's talking about. The Father and Son are may once more become one.
Yes. So when the mind is purified and the soul learns to gain this mastery over thoughts and emotions, then the mind becomes a natural extension of the soul. Then the mind doesn't go against the intelligence of the soul. The mind is there just as an expression of the soul, and that is when the two are unified.
And now he begins to understand the work that lies before him in the outer court with regard to his mind. He begins to realize that he himself is the living soul, and that instead of the mind being mastered, it must be an obedient instrument in the hand that holds it, and he begins to train his mind.
And this is why we were just talking.
In seeking to do this at first, he will have to begin with very simple matters. He will find that this mind is always running about from one thing to another, hard to control and difficult to curb. So this candidate of ours in his daily life, for he has to work out all this in the life of the world, will gradually train his mind in thinking consecutively, definitely, without allowing himself to be led astray by all the manifold temptations around him, to the scattering of thought in every direction. And this reminds me basically of what we do with our pet or with our young children. We train them, train's a tough word, but we do train them, and we do this more easily when we're consecutive, when we're consistent, when we have a definite direction, and we don't say yes sometimes and no other times. And so the same thing is with the mind. We have a definite direction and a definite purpose, but knowing that sometimes, we have to readjust.
Mm-hmm. In other writings, Besant talks a little more about this consecutive thinking that she calls it, which is basically, she says, the ability, and she's going to explain a little of this, but it's the ability to hold the attention for enough time to follow a line of thought, a line of argument. In order to follow a rather long line of thought and logic in an argument, the mind has to have the ability to pay attention. Today it is said people cannot pay attention for more than 10 minutes or even less. And it is true. Our culture is doing the opposite to what we need. Our culture is stimulating the mind with a lot of different stimuli, constantly changing, and our minds lose the ability to hold the attention. Even if you read this book by Besant, one paragraph, not only one paragraph, one sentence may be the whole page. This is how English was in the 19th century or early 20th. And today, modern English, it has very short sentences. You start and stop, because this is how long people can hold their attention. They lose the argument if it is a long sentence. So she says, we need to train ourselves in holding the attention and following long arguments.
I remember I was rereading this chapter today, and it was, my mind is so scattered today, and I really thought this is what she's talking about. Exactly. I have to reread, a sentence or a paragraph because I get distracted or pulled away or do this. So this is really, and like she says earlier, our daily life is really the practice where this can be done. And even as Pablo said, Facebook, they have limits. You only can use so many words or you'll lose the attention of somebody, or your video can only be so many minutes, otherwise people don't watch the whole thing. So
yeah, so this is part of reading early theosophical literature in itself is part of the training to be able to follow these arguments.
He will put aside the endless temptations that surround him in this superficial age and time. She's saying that 200 years ago.
No,
or
100 and something.
Yeah, 100 and something.
Today is even worse.
He will read by choice and by deliberate motive, for it is here that the thought of the candidate is trained. He will read sustained arguments, long lines of argument which train the mind in going along one definite line for a considerable period. He will learn to choose that of which he thinks. He will no longer allow thoughts to come and go. Permit a thought to grip him and hold him. He will be master within his own house.
So the training itself doesn't have at this point a spiritual quality necessarily. At this point is training the mind so that in the near future or a little later, we can use that mind for spiritual purposes. So, when Besant started to be trained by Blavatsky, she asked, what should I meditate on? And Besant says, I thought she was going to say the master or the absolute or unity. And Blavatsky gave her a matchbox, and say, fix your mind here. When you are able to fix your mind there and not be moved, then you can apply that mind to the spiritual subjects with some degree of success.
He may have troubles in his daily life. It matters not. They will help him in this training of the mind. And when these troubles are very pressing, when these anxieties are very trying, he will say, no. No such anxiety shall remain within my mind. No such thought shall have shelter within my mind. Within this mind, nothing stays that is not there by my choice and my invitation. This will be a definite training, a difficult and long training, for the thoughts break in and he has to turn them out. And over and over and over again, he must do this. I think it's next week's lecture. In that chapter, she talks about the mind being both the citadel and the gateway. So it's both the place where we stop what we don't want coming in there, and it also moves us to higher things. It's the gate that allows us to go to get to the soul, basically.
Mm-hmm. So this is part of the training in daily life. When there is something that is really big that stirs our emotion too profoundly, it's very difficult not to let the mind go there. But we can start with simpler things. We can start trying to not let our mind to go into things that we are. It's not really our business, or we are not really all that invested. And start with that. Start when you see that there are thoughts that are unhealthy. You say, I don't want to think about this. And start trying that discrimination. At some point, this becomes automatic, but not after a lot of work. As she says, it is a difficult training. We are talking about something that is the aim of evolution. We are not talking about some easy achievement like having
that
a PhD.
That you can move on from. Right?
Yeah,
you're going to move on.
Having a PhD is quite mechanical. You just go, you study, you will achieve it. And that is a very easy achievement when compared to this, that is the transformation of the personality into a temple of the divine. So you have to be patient. But all these things, little by little, we get the sense that, we are moving forward.
Right. We have a beautiful meditation here in the morning that I have been going to. And every now and then, my mind is so active that I feel like I can't sit and work on this meditation. So all I do instead there is I shift and I open my eyes and I focus on there's always beautiful flowers on the table. So I focus and I shift and I focus now on the flowers. and it's still useful. Even when it doesn't seem useful, it's still useful.
Yeah, that's how we have to work on these things.
You will say how. Probably at first, most easily by giving the mind something else to think about. Later on, by simply refusing to admit it. And by admit it, she means let it in.
Mm-hmm.
But until the candidate has grown strong enough thus to shut the doors of his mind and remain undisturbed, he may substitute some high thought which deals with the permanent for the thought he wants to get rid of, which deals with the transitory. For then it will serve the double purpose, not only of getting rid of the transitory thought, but also of habituating the mind to rest in the eternal, which is the secret of all peace in this world or in any other. And I'll throw in a little mid-step in there. When things are really tough, we can't always distract or change into something that's eternal. There's a little midway point that if we just distract or change our thought into something, a nice TV show or a nice piece of music or a nice book, that's a nice halfway point until we can get it to where we can switch it to a noble thought or a noble reading or just sit on on something that's more eternal.
Yes, because when we are worried, for example, or afraid or whatever it is, it's difficult because the state of consciousness itself is keeping us, within the lower. Many times it's difficult to try to contemplate the higher. So as Michele says, not as a way to escape from the thoughts. There are subtler differences that are very important differences. If I go to a movie just because I'm afraid to look at my thoughts or because I just want to bury my thoughts, I'm escaping and nothing will be solved. But if I consciously say, I try not to let my mind go in this direction, and I see that the mind is constantly being dragged, and I consciously say, okay, I will distract my mind, I will put my mind on something that may be pleasant for the mind, with this very deliberate intention not to let the mind go in the unhealthy direction. That is part of the training, and it is a good middle point. So then we can do it, we can start doing it with higher things. And then, as Besant says, at some point we acquire the ability to, when we see certain thoughts to say, no, stop. And then the mind just doesn't go there, period.
And as gradually he gains power over the mind, he will take a further step, which is more difficult. He will withdraw himself from the mind and think not in the mind at all, not because he is going to become unconscious, but because he is seeking a deeper consciousness, not because the life in him is dulling or becoming lethargic, but because it has become so vivid that the brain is no longer able to contain it. And this is where we're slaying the slayer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is where we're going beyond the mind into the soul thinking and slaying that slayer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you see what Besant is trying to show is this progression in which first we are at the mercy of the emotional reaction. So the first step is to take a stronghold in our minds and from the mind control the emotions. Then we start recognizing that the mind itself is not what I am. So at the beginning, kind of from the mind, we are beginning to control the mind. But then we learn to step back beyond the mind, and with this state of silent awareness, when we are in this state of silent awareness, the mind begins to be more harmonious. And then she says, we need to learn how to stay in a state of silence where thought is not involved. And in that state of silence, not a state of silence that is like a blank, dull mind, but a state of silence that is vibrant, that is very aware, active, but active not in the way of producing thoughts, active in the sense that there is a lot of silent energy there. And that is the step, the final step in this little journey that Besant is talking about.
And he will slowly find that it is possible to reach a stage where no longer is the thought of the mind, but the consciousness of the soul. Long ere he will find the consciousness and realize it, as it were, unbrokenly, he will have to pass through the stage of blankness, of emptiness, of void, one of the most trying stages, perchance, of this life of our candidate in the outer court.
So when we seek for this in meditation, what we find, and this is the experience of many people, is that when we try to let go of the sensations, emotions, and thoughts, most people say that that is a state that generates a certain kind of fear, or is frightening. This void, this emptiness, the lower self feels like I'm extinguished there.
I'm being abandoned.
Abandoned.
And the lower self fights back.
Mm-hmm.
It starts holding on, and it starts digging in, and it starts saying, wait a minute, I'm losing here.
Mm-hmm.
And then so there's a natural tendency to be anxious or afraid or what is this?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes people say, I felt that I needed to ground myself. But, many times that ground myself is to fall back into the ego. So there is this void, this emptiness that requires a renunciation, not of awareness, but a renunciation of our identification with the me. And if we can start dwelling in the void, in the emptiness, at some point, the higher consciousness flourishes, expresses itself. So that void is the dweller of the threshold, that is, guarding there, whether we can go beyond or not.
So what I wanted to say on this was most of us in this type of life that we're leading have had this experience in the physical. When we can no longer, go to a gathering and just spew our gossip or complain or things that like that, we notice that we have to be much more withdrawn. We have to be quieter. When we start doing that with our thoughts and we start saying, okay, well, I can't think badly about this other person, or I can't think about complaining, or I can't, our mind tends to say, whoa, wait a minute, I'm being a little isolated here. And I always think of it like my mind is doing a Rolodex. It's looking for something in that silence that it can grab onto, that it knows. So we've done this before. We've done it physically. We've done it with our emotions. Now we're doing it with our thinking process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this all happens. And we have to take this journey, with a sense of adventure, with a sense of fun, and, know that these things happen and we need to play with it, because otherwise we just get frustrated and angry. And no, this is a wonderful journey, difficult, but everything that is worth doing, is difficult.
And that's a process too, because first comes the frustration and the why is this going on, and the doubt and the questioning. And then all of a sudden you get this glimpse, and Pablo's right. It is a playfulness that you're like, whoa, okay, now I get it. And then come those subtle temptations from the thought world thronging around him from every side. He must have attained utter control over the mental images he himself has created, ere he will be able to hold his own unshaken, serene, unruffled amid all these hosts of hurrying thoughts that are now coming to him, vitalized and strengthened, no longer by the feeble minds of men of the lower world, but with a tremendous impulse from the dark side.
So this is talking more about the experience of the person that is crossing the threshold of the outer court into the real occult path, where and we, in our training, many times we feel things like this. I remember even when I was a teenager going to church, that it was typical that somebody would say, the moment that I propose myself to do something, not to do something wrong, I feel how Satan comes and tempts me And this, to some extent, happens from the very beginning. But as we approach the occult path, where the disciple begins to be a cosmic force for goodness, there are also other forces that will fight back in a certain sense. And this is all part of the balance. And in the fighting back is how the disciple, acquire its own powers and mastery. But sometimes you will feel like your thoughts are being fueled by something that is beyond your power. You can feel the strength of your thoughts in a wrong direction. And in those cases, all you have to do is do your best. Try to, master your mind and emotions the best you can. And even if you fail, all that effort, all that earnestness will be generating spiritual power.
Right. The example I give is on the lines that Pablo was talking about is you find $20 and you turn it in and you're so happy and you're so proud of yourself. But then life seems to say, look at that really good person. Let's see what he does with $20 when he has no money. And so do you still do that? And it just seems like the more you reach that threshold and get over, there's another one, and then there's another one, and then there's another one. So,
which is how we train people in anything.
Right.
Once, a person is able to do something, you give that person a little harder task.
Right.
And in that way is how a person, trains.
Right. Deborah says, who is having the fun, us or the soul? Pablo may have a different answer to this, but I can tell you my personality is never happy. It's never having fun. So it's got to be the soul that is enjoying it.
Yeah, the soul is always enjoying it. And the personality is the soul itself, but thinking that it is the personality. As we said, the soul confused. So when that sense of fun comes to the personality, that means that it is the soul that can retain the awareness, I am more than this. But when that awareness cannot be brought to the personality, yes, at the level of the personality, there is frustration, but the soul is always having fun.
Then comes the strength of the mind that now can fix itself on what it will and stay there unshaken, no matter what whirlwind may be going on around. A fixity so great, so steady, that nothing that is without can avail to shake it at all, that it does not need effort any longer, for it has gone beyond the stage where such effort is necessary. The stronger the soul, the less of effort in its working. The mightier the power, the less it feels assaults that come to it from without. And the result of this, which is the beginning of the blending of the mind and of the soul, is that the moment anything alien strikes against it, it falls dead of its own impulsion. That's very nice.
Yeah, so that is the expression of where this leads us. And this is always the case. At the beginning, there seems to be the need for a lot of effort. And for the most part, unless we make that effort, we don't move forward. But the true realization comes when the effort is not necessary any longer. And again, this is just like in regular life.
This is a goal of any physical activity, of any sport team or any, music or any art, is when it becomes effortless. And they say nothing is fun until it becomes effortless. So even speaking a language or studying a subject, it's not fun until it becomes effortless. Yeah, but it's always hard work at first. You can't get around that.
Yeah, so the same happens with the soul, let's say.
It is in the place of rest. There the will is beginning to be realized, where there is absolute peace. It is then in the tranquility of the senses that he beholds the majesty of the soul. Then he sees indeed, for the first time, no longer by broken gleam, but in this absolute peace and serenity where there is no desire and no ruffling of grief. There, the majesty of the soul shines out unbroken, and the mind, now a mirror which is polished, reflects it back as it really is. And just the he is the candidate in the outer court.
Yeah. So at this point, the mind has been purified. The soul has acquire this skill to control the mind. And now the mind is a mirror that doesn't distort the reflection of the soul. So that mind would be, at the physical level, the brain. Now the brain is not distorting the soul that is trying to express through it. It's not putting heavy conditioning on it more than the organic limitation of the brain. But as far as the brain is able to express it, the soul is fully expressed through it. And the mind can reflect the true essence of the soul. And this is the blending of the mind.
Right. And this is the point. We even do this in small bits now and then, when we can understand why a person is angry and we know that it's not us, they're just angry. When we can have those little bits of insight and still remain peaceful in a conflictive environment, we're doing this. Mm-hmm. And this is the state that we're reaching towards, that we will get there.